On this Tuesday night, desperate times call for desperate measures in Quebec. With Omicron spreading like wildfire, the province changes its rules to allow some COVID-positive essential workers to remain on the job.
Omicron's contagion is so exponential, we have no choice.
What other provinces are doing to deal with the surge. The new quarantine guidance in the U.S., shortening isolation time as states report an explosion of cases. Plus, record-shattering cold in Western Canada. How long the frigid temperatures are expected to last. And defying the odds and making a splash.
I'm so proud of him. He came a long way.
The transformative power of art for a young boy with epilepsy.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Colleen Christie.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. We begin once again tonight with developments related to the Omicron variant. Across Canada, case numbers are climbing like never before. Today, Quebec set a new record with more than 12,000 new infections in just 24 hours. It's still unclear whether the surge will lead to a similar spike in hospitalizations, though Quebec says the sheer number of cases is already causing major strain. The province says about 7,000 healthcare workers were off the job yesterday due to COVID. The province is now making a major change to rules for infected workers to try to keep hospitals staffed. Abigail Bimman explains in tonight's top story.
We have no choice.
In the face of another record number of cases and thousands of healthcare staff off the job, Quebec makes a controversial move, allowing some essential staff who test positive to work.
There is people who really have some symptoms, very soft ones, who can go work again and they feel okay. They could go in certain units where there's already COVID people positive.
Details aren't all clear. Unions are worried about their members and the public.
And now we're asking them, on top of giving your 110% normally, now you have to come in sick and do your job. For us, it makes absolutely no sense.
A balancing act for a province and country full of exhausted healthcare staff.
We're so much more tired because we haven't had new people come in, and that's why the morale is low, and that's why it's difficult.
No such move in Ontario, but the top doctor there is now considering new CDC guidance, cutting isolation periods in half. In long-term care, where 41 homes have outbreaks, new restrictions as of Thursday.
All general visits to long-term care homes will be paused.
The latest data from the Ontario Science Table shows while 2 doses of vaccine still offer very high protection against hospitalization,
your protection against infection is comparable to those who haven't been vaccinated at all right now.
Dr. Peter Uni says the next 8 weeks will be tough, but then things will change.
Nearly everybody here in Ontario and in Canada will be immune, at least partially, either through vaccination or through infection.
In the short term, parents are anxious for news about school.
They'll be having an announcement in the next couple of days, but we just want to see how things go.
While Nova Scotia says school will start a week late, but kids will be in class.
Having kids in school is the best decision to minimize overall harms to children and youth.
Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
At the World Juniors in Alberta, Team USA forfeited a game against Switzerland today after 2 players tested positive for COVID-19. The International Ice Hockey Federation says the defending champions are under team quarantine. The federation says a decision will be made later on whether the U.S. can play Sweden tomorrow. In the U.S., the Omicron variant is spreading like wildfire. Testing sites are swamped. Hospitalizations are up. And now the Centre for Disease Control has cut quarantine guidelines in half for positive asymptomatic patients. It comes as airline and healthcare worker shortages grow. Jennifer Johnson has the latest.
As more and more healthcare and airline workers are sidelined by COVID-19, the Centers for Disease Control made a surprising announcement, reducing the quarantine period for positive but asymptomatic patients from 10 to 5 days.
If you look at the chance of getting a transmission in that second half of that 10-day period, it's considerably less than in those first few days.
But the CDC strongly recommends mask wearing from days 5 to 10. The agency has been getting heat from airlines who have been forced to cancel thousands of flights over the holiday due to staff shortages.
About 4 o'clock in the morning, and got to the airport, got on the plane, everything was fine, and then one of the pilots didn't show up.
Travel experts say the post-Christmas chaos at airports will continue through the new year. Airlines are taking drastic measures, cutting dozens of routes.
They pulled out of a number of cities. Americans pulled out of 26 cities. Delta and United about 10 cities each.
Now hospitalizations of children are drastically increasing too, up 35% from last week. New York City has seen a 5-fold increase in pediatric admissions this month. Desperate to stop the spread, the mayor is now offering $100 incentives for people who get the booster shot.
We talk about every day, we've seen a huge uptick.
New daily cases in the U.S. are now surpassing 180,000 a day.
We've moved backwards. It's really disheartening to see that this many months, if not years later in the pandemic.
With many testing sites and pharmacies out of COVID-19 tests, U.S. President Joe Biden is promising states federal help.
I know the lines have gotten very long in some states. That's why I ordered FEMA to set up pop-up sites in places with high demand.
The president is also planning to use funds from the Defense Production Act, usually set aside for wars, to produce 500 million rapid at-home test kits as America wages its latest battle against this virus. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
Today in the UK, another daily record for new COVID-19 cases with more than 129,000. It comes as Scotland and other places in the UK tighten restrictions to try to reduce the spread of Omicron, but not in England. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says no rules will change before the new year. Redmond Shannon reports.
It's estimated 1.7 million people in the UK had COVID-19 last week, forcing many to pare back holiday celebrations.
We try to be sensible and both protect ourselves and each other.
Now nightclubs in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have closed, and other hospitality venues face new restrictions. But in England, the rules are more lax and will stay that way for now.
There will be no further measures before the new year. We won't be taking any further measures. Of course, people should remain cautious as we approach New Year celebrations.
For much of the pandemic, rules in England have been looser than in the other UK nations, or they began later.
Get that jab.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government is betting on boosters and on the early evidence that Omicron is less severe.
That's good news, but we know that it spreads very rapidly, so we have to set that news against that.
And many of those on the front lines of healthcare are worried that allowing a free-for-all on New Year's is a big risk.
The view is very clear. It's still too early to tell about whether we are going to see larger numbers of older people coming in, needing that kind of care.
Part of the reason for England's divergence may be that Johnson is a leader under pressure from the Libertarian side of his own party. Those MPs have rebelled during votes on other COVID rules. Comparing England's situation to the rest of the UK 1 month from now will determine if Johnson made the right call and may help us all better understand Omicron. Redmond Shannon, Global News.
The bitter cold snap gripping Western Canada isn't letting up just yet, and organizations caring for vulnerable people say it's taking a serious toll.
The things that we're seeing come through the door is extreme frostbite and lack of appropriate outerwear, things like that. So, a lot of people coming in crying a lot because it hurts so much, of course, when your feet start to unthaw.
Weather warnings are in place for much of the West. Virtually all of Alberta is under an extreme cold alert, as well as most of Saskatchewan and BC. The Alberta Motor Association says it's dealing with an 800% increase in calls for roadside assistance. This morning in Edmonton, the estimated wait time for a tow was more than 3 days. So how much longer will this extreme cold last? Let's bring in Chief Meteorologist Anthony Farnell now. Anthony, what can we expect over the next few days?
Colleen, it's going to be a few days, but there's already signs that conditions are improving, especially for BC into Alberta. The temperature's still frigid, but it's not quite as windy. The heart of the cold has been in Saskatchewan. That's now moving into Manitoba, minus 21 after yesterday's snow in Winnipeg. It's only going to get colder for the next couple of days. And when you factor in the wind, still some areas close to minus 40 wind chill. At night, that drops to near minus 50. Let's talk about the good news. Temperatures in Alberta 12 degrees warmer today, right now in Calgary than it was yesterday. Edmonton also milder. Same thing with Vancouver, 5 degrees warmer than on Monday. What's causing this crazy record cold? Well, we have this ridge just off the west coast bringing warmth to Alaska. That's allowed Siberian air to make its way into Western Canada. That's now been cut off, but the cold has nowhere to go, so it's going to take some time to slowly moderate as we move through and into the new year. Colleen?
Thanks, Anthony. A year of reckoning. Coming up, the necessary work ahead for Canada in the name of truth and reconciliation. 2021 was a year of reckoning for Canada. In May, 215 unmarked graves were discovered near the site of a former residential school in Kamloops, and more discoveries across the country followed. It forced non-Indigenous Canadians to take a hard look at the horrific treatment of Indigenous children and present-day injustices to Indigenous peoples. And while there has been some change, the work is far from done. Here's Heather Urex West.
It was news that shocked and rattled the world. 215 unmarked graves, many belonging to children, found near the site of a residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. For anyone unfamiliar with the country's history of taking Indigenous children by force from their families to be assimilated in church-run institutions, the revelation was a horrific surprise. But for survivors, hearing that children were found buried there only confirmed things long known.
They would scoot us from the dormitory to the church. Don't mind the graves, don't mind the graves, and just walk by.
Bernard Jack has carried the trauma of his time at the Christie Roman Catholic Residential School on Vancouver Island for over 5 decades. He was a 6-year-old boy when he was first taken from his mom and dad.
We were basically dumped at the wharf where priests and nuns were waiting for us. The really bad bedwetters were tied to the top of the bunk and strapped, literally strapped. And you could just hear their screams to cover up the other screams.
Jack says 2021 has been a year of painful remembering, but validation too, because at last non-Indigenous Canadians and people around the world are finally confronting the truth. This year saw Canada mark the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th, a day to be observed annually so all Canadians can stop and reflect.
People had heard the information before, but I think seeing the physical evidence of it was very difficult for people to turn away from. And it allowed them to question more about what is going on today.
Because although Canada's last residential school closed in the 1990s, thousands of Indigenous kids are still being taken from their families. Only now, it's through the child welfare system instead.
Before, I think that there was really a white noise barrier between residential schools and the contemporary injustices. I think slowly, thanks to those discoveries, that's starting to be pierced through.
Earlier this year, a federal court upheld an order by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that Ottawa pay compensation to First Nations children's families who have been harmed by the government's underfunding of child and family services on reserve. This month, the federal government announced $40 billion was being set aside to be spent not only compensating families, but fixing a broken system too. Negotiations on a deal with Indigenous child welfare advocates still continue, with a deadline of December 31st.
This is 30 years of the cost of failure, and that cost is high.
There will be more work to do to achieve reconciliation with the Canadian government, but there are also calls for greater truth and transparency from the Catholic churches who operated residential schools. Next year, an Indigenous delegation will head to the Vatican to meet with the head of the Catholic Church. Their planned visit was cancelled because of COVID this month. Pope Francis has agreed to come to Canada as well.
We have the opportunity to have the tone start at the top, meaning the Pope of the Church, to come to Canada and set the tone with an apology
The Cowessess First Nation is working to identify more than 750 unmarked graves identified last summer near the Maryvale Residential School. Chief Cadmus Delorme says that saying sorry must only be the start of the church's work. Moving forward, the church needs to be a partner in reconciliation.
If it doesn't happen like that, I do see in 50 years, we're going to hand this off to the next generation to figure out.
It's like, for instance, if he was driving a bus full of 26 people, kids in there, and crash, all the kids die and he survives it. Oh, I'm sorry. That doesn't mean anything.
For Bernard Jack, the residential school system changed his life. It destroyed the lives of many around him and continues to impact his children and grandchildren's lives today. Generational trauma can extend hurt through families for decades. Jack says a papal apology alone is not justice in his mind. But every step towards the truth, that's at least a good place to begin. Heather Urix West, Global News, Calgary.
Ahead, fixing your finances, tips for making resolutions, and keeping yourself on track.
You're watching Global National.
It's the season for New Year's resolutions, and according to Ipsos polling exclusively for Global News, nearly half of us plan to make a big effort to do things differently in 2022. Many of those New Year's goals are about money, and Gaviola has more on how to stick to your finance-related resolutions.
Whether it's getting into better shape or choosing healthier options, the new year may seem like the perfect time to commit to new goals.
In the new year, you're able to have a fresh perspective.
According to Ipsos polling for Global News, 41% said they plan to make New Year's resolutions. Of those people, 48% aim to pay off debt, 45% want to make and stick to a budget, 36% want to save for a rainy day, and 34% say they want to save money for retirement and invest in 2022. You've heard of dry January, right? Well, instead of cutting out booze, personal finance author Melissa Leong plans to spend only on necessities for at least 21 days in January. Her advice for sticking to a money-related resolution: be clear about why you're saving.
For example, people who put money into envelopes labeled with their children's names were less likely to dip into those envelopes because it had a greater meaning for them.
And if you can automate savings so the money comes right out of your account, then you're more likely to stick to your goals.
A lot of people put savings at the bottom of their personal finance plan, so they spend on their bills first, and they spend on their wants next, and then they, save whatever's left over. Flip that around. Start saving first.
When it comes to deciding what your targets are, be specific and realistic.
You can say to yourself, by December 31, 2022, I want to save $3,000, and I will do so by setting aside money every single paycheck. It's just as simple as that. Rather than saying, I want to save.
Start building those habits that might last throughout then the year in a month's time. So every time you want to make a purchase, say, for example, more than $100, say, I'm going to spend 24 hours thinking about this purchase before I actually make it.
Once you're clear on your goals, find an accountability partner and schedule check-ins to keep you on track. If you don't feel comfortable choosing a friend or family member, you can find an online community just for this.
Studies show that when you have an accountability partner, people with peer support actually save more money, even if that conversation was through text, than those who did not.
One final piece of advice: even if you follow all of these steps, life happens and you could get derailed. Go easy on yourself if your 2022 plans are delayed, and become part of your financial resolutions for 2023. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Next, therapy through art. How the pandemic helped uncover a new passion for a Toronto boy with epilepsy. We don't have to remind you how difficult and dark these last few years have felt. But if you've thrown yourself into a creative project during the pandemic, you know how powerful it can be. Karen Lieberman has the story of how painting has changed the life of one Toronto boy.
Blue and orange and yellow and green.
Alessandro Rosati wants to be an artist when he grows up. His mother says the fact that he can even articulate that is a miracle.
Good job. We always say he's a warrior and a fighter.
Alessandro is only 7, but his medical history is long. He survived neonatal meningitis followed by a stroke, and he's had 2 brain surgeries.
He also had infantile spasm, which is a very rare type of seizures. From there, he developed epilepsy, and right now he's dealing with ADHD and global delay.
Doctors weren't sure Alessandro would ever walk or talk.
That's how you do that.
I'm so proud of him. He came a long way. He still takes therapies and
I went to the Lego show.
Okay.
You see the gold? That's kind of like Venus.
So you see Venus and you see the Earth.
And Mars.
Mars is there.
Jupiter.
He has plenty to say, mostly about his art.
Neptune.
When the pandemic began, life in lockdown was difficult for this family.
When we were stuck at home, it was very hard. So, I had to think of things and then school on top of that. We were doing school from home.
Painting became Alessandro's passion.
I'm gonna be on TV.
I think we found his hidden talent. He actually sold few as a request. I shipped few paintings to US, to New York and Texas.
I did.
His latest creation, a painting to be auctioned off for Sick Kids Hospital, a way to give back. Alessandro also fundraises for Epilepsy Toronto.
It means that we can continue to give the support that we gave to that family to many other families, and many other people. 1 in 100 people live with epilepsy. That's over 40,000 people in the Toronto area.
For Alessandro, creating unique artwork is therapeutic. Karen Lieberman, Global News, Toronto.
Beautiful, Alessandro. And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Colleen Christie. Tonight's Your Canada is this festive scene at Butchart Gardens in Brentwood Bay, BC, a place I know well. There are beautiful spots all over Canada. Please email us yours to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you here again tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Good night.